Hello everyone. Welcome to another one of our reading sessions called The 7 Days of Halloween. And today is day 5, but we're going to change the program a little bit because the story we started reading yesterday, The Duchess at Prayer by Edith Wharton, is a bit longer than the other stories we've read so far, so I decided to divide it into 2 parts. So yesterday we began with part 1. Hello Laddie, nice to have you here. We'll continue reading The Duchess at Prayer by Edith Wharton. The American novelist, the first woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize in 1920 with the novel The Age of Innocence, which is a great novel, by the way. And Edith Wharton also wrote, in addition to those realist novels, ghost stories. I have this collection here of the ghost stories of Edith Wharton, and I selected The Duchess at Prayer to read during the 7 days of Halloween. This story was published for the first time at the Scribner magazine in August 1900. So let me know if you've already seen part 1 of this video. If not, we can recap the story a little bit. So it started with this gentleman. It starts with a very gothic description of this old villa. Do you remember? And all highlighting, emphasizing all these Gothic elements of the house and personifying the house in a way. She writes about the tall windows that are like blind eyes and the great door like a shut mouth. I think it's very nicely done how she describes and personifies the house, making it even creepier by doing so. So this is a house, a villa in Italy, and there is this gentleman who goes there in the present time of this narrative, to see the house that has been abandoned for the past 200 years. Nay says didn't get the name of the book, so we are reading the short story Duchess at Prayer, which is a short story from the Ghost Stories of Edith Wharton. We read the first part yesterday, and today we're going to continue with part 2. So this gentleman arrives at this house and he asks the gardener if he could see the house inside. He says that no one has been there in the past 200 years, but he will show him the house. And he wants to see the Duchess' apartments. They go in, they see the portrait of the Duke and the Duchess, and the gentleman is very disturbed when he sees there, as you go through the Duchess's apartments. Hello, Lucas, nice to have you here. As you go through the Duchess' apartment, you end up in the Duchess's chapel, and there in the chapel there is a statue, very lifelike, very creepy statue of the Duchess at Prayer. Hence the title, The Duchess at Prayer. And the gardener starts telling the gentleman a story about this statue, because according to his grandmother, who was, back in the day, 200 years ago, had been a girl servant to the Duchess. And she told him firsthand that the statue that has a ghastly face, the gentleman was horrified when he looked at the statue's face because she was frozen in this horror-like expression. And the gardener said, the keeper says that the statue was not always like that. And he's going to tell the story of how it happened. So he tells about the story of the woman, young woman whom the Duke married, This woman really enjoyed the social events in the big cities, in Venice, going to the theater, to museum, galleries. But that was not really the lifestyle of the Duke. The Duke was very reserved. He preferred to stay in his study, in his library, reading, studying his books. So they ended up falling apart, right? And the Duke would leave the Duchess in the villa all alone, and he would, and she would stay there for long periods of time by herself. Nage is asking if the registration for the course is still open. It has closed today, but the website is still on until 23:59, until 11:59 p.m. tonight. So if you still want a very, 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 very last chance, you can take a look at booksandculture.club. Take a look. The course, Module 1, starts tomorrow, and we already have a group. So the story continues. The Duchess is all alone in this villa in the middle of nowhere, and there is a cousin of the Duke, a young gentleman, Cavalier. What was his name again? Cavalier Ascanio, who has a similar mindset as the Duchess, and they start to spend a lot of time together, having fun, listening to music, dancing, playing tricks on the servants. And when the Duke comes at unannounced, he sees the two of them talking in a very intimate manner, and he takes the Cavalier away, and he never returns. So this is how the story stopped. We'll continue reading from then on. So we'll finally know what happened to the statue to make it change in that way. So here we go. So the I telling the story here is the story within the story, very Gothic trope. So the story within the story is the gardener's story telling the gentleman that's visiting the house, the Duchess's story. Okay. Now, I may not have told you, sir, the gardener is speaking, that in the crypt under the chapel there has stood, for more generations than a man can count, a stone coffin containing a thigh bone of the blessed Saint Blandina of Lyon, a relic offered, I've been told, by some great Duke of France to one of our own dukes when they fought the Turk together, and the object ever since of particular veneration in this illustrious family. Now, since the Duchess had been left to herself, it was observed she affected a fervent devotion to this relic, praying often in the chapel, and even causing the stone slab that covered the entrance to the crypt to be replaced by a wooden one, that she might at will descend and kneel by the coffin. This was matter of edification to all the household, and should have been peculiarly pleasing to the chaplain. But, with respect to you, he was the kind of man who brings a sour mouth to the eating of the sweetest apple. However that may be, the Duchess, when she dismissed him, was seen running to the garden, where she talked earnestly with the boy Antonio about the new clove carnations, and the rest of the day she sat indoors and played sweetly on the virginal. Now Nencia always had it in mind that her Grace had made a mistake in refusing that request of the chaplain's, but she said nothing, for to talk reason to the Duchess was of no more use than praying for rain in a drought. Winter came early that year. There was snow on the hills by All Souls. The wind stripped the gardens, and the lemon trees were nipped in the lemon house. The Duchess kept her room in this black season, sitting over the fire, embroidering, reading books of devotion, which was a thing she had never done, and praying frequently in the chapel. As for the chaplain, it was a place he never set foot in but to say mass in the morning, with the Duchess overhead in the tribune, and the servants aching with rheumatism on the marble floor. The chaplain himself hated the cold and galloped through the mass like a man with witches after him. The rest of the day he spent in his library over a brazier with his eternal books. You'll wonder, sir, if I'm ever to get to the gist of the story, and I've gone slowly, I own, for fear of what's coming. Well, the winter was long and hard. When it fell cold, the Duke ceased to come out from Vicenza, and not a soul had the Duchess to speak to but her maidservants and the gardeners about the place. Yet it was wonderful, my grandmother said, how she kept her brave colours and her spirits. Only it was remarked that she prayed longer in the chapel, where a brazier was kept burning for her all day. When the young are denied their natural pleasures, they turn often enough to religion. And it was a mercy, as my grandmother said, that she, who had scarce a live sinner to speak to, should take such comfort in a dead saint. My grandmother seldom saw her that winter, for though she showed a brave front to all, she kept more and more to herself, choosing to have only Nencia about her, and dismissing even her when she went to pray. For her devotion has that mark of true piety that she wished it not to be observed, so that Nencia had strict orders on the chaplain's approach to warn her mistress if she happened to be in prayer. So it's interesting that as soon as the Duchess became left to herself, she was left alone, the Cavalier was sent away. Instead of becoming more depressed and gloomy, she continued to be in brave spirits, happy, but she prayed more and more, and she would spend more and more time in the crypt praying for this saint relic. But the question is, do you think that's really what was going on? She would spend all this time in the crypt by herself. No one else was allowed in. Think about it. What could possibly be the reason? Let's continue. Well, the winter passed and spring was well forward when my grandmother one evening had a bad fright. That it was her own fault, I won't deny, for she'd been down the lime walk with Antonio when her aunt fancied her to be stitching in her chamber. And seeing a sudden light in Nencia's window, she took fright lest her disobedience be found, and ran up quickly through the laurel grove to the house. Her way lay by the chapel, and as she crept past it, meaning to slip in through the scullery and groping her way, for the dark had fallen and the moon was scarce up, she heard a crash close behind her, as though someone had dropped from a window of the chapel. The young fool's heart turned over, but she looked round as she ran, and there, sure enough, was a man scuttling across the terrace. And as he doubled the corner of the house, my grandmother swore she caught the whisk of the chaplain's skirts. Now that was a strange thing, certainly, for why would the chaplain be getting out of the chapel window when he might have passed through the door? For you may have noticed, sir, there's a door leads from the chapel into the saloon on the ground floor, the only other way out being through the Duchess's tribune. Well, my grandmother turned the matter over, and next time she met Antonio in the lime walk, which, by reason of her fright, was not for some days, she laid before him what had happened. But to her surprise, he only laughed and said, "You little simpleton, he wasn't getting out of the window. He was trying to look in." And not another word could she get from him. So the chaplain had been spying on the Duchess to find out what is it that she was doing for so long inside the chapel. So the season moved on to Easter, and news came the Duke had gone to Rome for that holy festivity. His comings and goings made no change at the villa, and yet there was no one there but felt easier to think his yellow face was on the fair side of the Apennines, unless perhaps it was the chaplain. Well, it was one day in May that the Duchess, who had walked long with Nencia on the terrace, rejoicing at the sweetness of the prospect and the pleasant scent of the gilly flowers in the stone vases. The Duchess towards midday withdrew to her rooms, giving orders that her dinner should be served in her bedchamber. My grandmother helped to carry in the dishes, and observed, she said, the singular beauty of the Duchess, who in honor of the fine weather had put on a gown of shot silver and hung her bare shoulders with pearls, so that she looked fit to dance at court with an emperor. She had ordered too a rare repast for a lady, that heeded so little what she ate. Jellies, game pasties, fruits in syrup, spiced cakes, and a flagon of Greek wine, and she nodded and clapped her hands as the women set it before her, saying again and again, "I shall eat well today." But presently another mood seized her. She turned from the table, called for her rosary, and said to Nencia, "The fine weather has made me neglect my devotions. I must say a litany before I dine." She ordered the women out and barred the door as her custom was, and Nencia and my grandmother went downstairs to work in the linen room. So this is another hint here, right? That then although the narrator, the gardener, does not seem aware of that, but there is a hint here of what was going on. So the Duchess would get dressed in very beautiful clothes and with jewelry, and would order a lot of food, although she didn't eat much, and wanted that to be served in her room. Now, why would she do all of that if she were alone? And then she said she needed to pray, and that's why she closed the door and everyone had to leave. Now, the linen room gives on the courtyard, and suddenly my grandmother saw a strange sight approaching. First up the avenue came the Duke's carriage, whom all thought to be in Rome, and after it, drawn by a long string of mules and oxen, a cart carrying what looked like a kneeling figure wrapped in death clothes. The strangeness of it struck the girl dumb, and the Duke's coach was at the door before she had the wit to cry out that it was coming. Nencia, when she saw it, went white and ran out of the room. My grandmother followed, scared by her face, and the two fled along the corridor to the chapel. On the way, they met the chaplain, deep in a book, who asked in surprise where they were running, and when they said to announce the Duke's arrival, he fell into such astonishment and asked them so many questions and uttered such ohs and ahs that by the time he let them, the Duke was at their heels. Nencia reached the chapel door first and cried out that the Duke was coming, and before she had a reply, he was at her side, with the chaplain following. So the Duke was supposed to be away in Rome for the festivities, and he arrives all of a sudden, and everyone is so astonished that no one had the time to move quickly or the wit to move quickly and let the Duchess know that the Duke was coming. A moment later, the door opened, and there stood the Duchess. She held her rosary in one hand and had drawn a scarf over her shoulders, but they shone through it like the moon in a mist, and her countenance sparkled with beauty. The Duke took her hand with a bow. "Madam," he said, "I could have had no greater happiness than thus to surprise you at your devotions." "My own happiness," she replied, "would have been greater had you, Your Excellency, prolonged it by giving me notice of your arrival." "Had you expected me, madam," said he, "your appearance could scarcely have been more fitted to the occasion. Few ladies of your youth and beauty array themselves to venerate a saint as they would to welcome a lover." "Sir," she answered, having never enjoyed the latter opportunity, "I am constrained to make the most of the former." "What's that?" she cried, falling back, and the rosary dropped from her hand. There was a loud noise at the other end of the saloon, as of a heavy object being dragged down the passage. And presently 12 men were seen hauling across the threshold the shrewd thing from the ox cart. The Duke waved his hand toward it. "That," said he, "madam, is a tribute to your extraordinary piety. I have heard with peculiar satisfaction of your devotion to the blessed relics in this chapel, and to commemorate a zeal with which neither the rigors of winter nor the sultriness of summer could abate, I have ordered a sculptured image of you, marvelously executed by the Cavalier Bernini, to be placed before the altar over the entrance to the crypt." The Duchess, who had grown pale, nevertheless smiled playfully at this. "As to commemorating my piety," she said, "I recognize there one of your Excellency's pleasantries." "A pleasantry?" the Duke interrupted, and he made a sign to the men who had now reached the threshold of the chapel. In an instant the wrappings fell from the figure, and there knelt the Duchess to the life. A cry of wonder rose from all, but the Duchess herself stood whiter than the marble. "You will see," says the Duke, "this is no pleasantry, but a triumph of the incomparable Bernini's chisel. The likeness was done from your miniature portrait by the divine Elisabetta Sirani, which I sent to the master some 6 months ago, with what results all must admire." "6 months!" cried the Duchess, and seemed about to fall, but His Excellency caught her by the hand. "Nothing," he said, "could better please me than the excessive emotion you display, for true piety is ever modest, and your thanks could not take a form that better become you. And now," says he to the men, "let the image be put into place." By this time, life seemed to have returned to the Duchess, and she answered him with a deep reverence. "That I should be overcome by so unexpected a grace, your Excellency admits to be natural. But what honors you accorded is my privilege to accept, and I entreat only that in mercy to my modesty, the image be placed in the remotest part of the chapel." At that the Duke darkened. "What? You would have this masterpiece of a renowned chisel, which I disguise not cost me the price of a good vineyard in gold pieces. You would have it thrust out of sight like the work of a village stone-cutter?" "It is my semblance, not the sculptor's work, I desire to conceal." "If you are fit for my house, madam, you are fit for God's, and entitled to the place of honor in both. Bring the statue forward, you dawdlers," he called out to the men. So the Duke arrives unexpectedly, and he finds the Duchess so beautiful, with such a beautiful gown and jewels, all by herself praying, and in order to recognize and to give her a gift because of her so deep devotion, the Duke, ordered a statue of the Duchess praying, and he wants to put that statue in front of the entrance to the chapel, where the Duchess has been going so often for the past months. But for some reason, the Duchess does not want that, and she's coming up with excuses for the Duke to bring it somewhere else. But the Duke does not want to change his mind. The Duchess fell back submissively. "You are right, sir, as always. But I would at least have the image stand on the left of the altar, that looking up it may behold your Excellency's seat in the tribune." "A pretty thought, madam, for which I thank you, but I design before long to put my companion image on the other side of the altar. And the wife's place, as you know, is at her husband's right hand." True, my lord, but again, if my poor presentment is to have the unmerited honor of kneeling beside yours, why not place both before the altar, where it is our habit to pray in life? And where, madam, should we kneel if they took our places? Besides, says the Duke, still speaking very blandly, I have a more particular purpose in placing your image over the entrance to the crypt. For not only would I thereby mark your special devotion to the blessed saint who rests there, but by sealing up the opening in the pavement would assure the perpetual preservation of that holy martyr's bones, which hitherto have been too thoughtlessly exposed to sacrilegious attempts. What attempts, my lord? Cries the Duchess. No one enters this chapel without my leave. So I have understood, and can well believe from what I have learned of your piety. Yet at night a malefactor might break in through a window, madam, and your excellency not know it. I'm a light sleeper, said the Duchess. The Duke looked at her gravely. Indeed, said he, a bad sign at your age. I must see that you are provided with a sleeping draught. The Duchess's eyes filled. You would deprive me, then, of the consolation of visiting those venerable relics? I would have you keep eternal guard over them, knowing no one to whose care they may more fittingly be entrusted. At this the image was brought close to the wooden slab that covered the entrance to the crypt, when the Duchess, springing forward, placed herself in the way. Sir, let the statue be put in place tomorrow, and suffer me tonight to say a last prayer beside those holy bones. The Duke stepped instantly to her side. Well thought, madam. I will go down with you now, and we will pray together. Sir, your long absences have, alas, given me the habit of solitary devotion, and I confess that any presence is distracting. Madam, I accept your rebuke. Hitherto, it is true, the duties of my station have constrained me to long absences, but henceforward I remain with you while you live. Shall we go down into the crypt together? No, for I fear for your excellency's ache. The air there is excessively damp. The more reason you should no longer be exposed to it. And to prevent the intemperance of your zeal, I will at once make the place inaccessible. So you see what's going on in this conversation here, right? There is something in the crypt that the Duchess wants to protect from anyone's eyes, especially the Duke's. And the Duke probably knows what has been going on because he's so adamant in putting the statue there right now to seal the entrance to the crypt and not to let the Duchess in by herself again. Let's see what will happen next. The Duchess at this fell on her knees on the slab, weeping excessively and lifting her hands to heaven. Oh, she cried, you were cruel, sir, to deprive me of access to the sacred relics that have enabled me to support with resignation the solitude to which your excellency's duties have condemned me. And if prayer and meditation give me any authority to pronounce on such matters, suffer me to warn you, sir, that I fear the blessed Saint Blandina will punish us for thus abandoning her venerable remains. The Duke at this seemed to pause, for he was a pious man, and my grandmother thought she saw him exchange a glance with the chaplain. Remember, the chaplain probably saw something on that day, peeping through the window, right? So he exchanged a glance with the chaplain, who, stepping timidly forward with his eyes on the ground, said, There is indeed much wisdom in Her Excellency's words, but I would suggest, sir, that her pious wish might be met and the saint more conspicuously honored by transferring the relics from the crypt to a place beneath the altar. True, cried the Duke, and it shall be done at once. But thereat the Duchess rose to her feet with a terrible look. No, she cried, by the body of God, for it shall not be said that after your excellency has chosen to deny every request I address to him, I owe his consent to the solicitation of another. The chaplain turned red, and the Duke yellow, and for a moment neither spoke. Then the Duke said, Here are words enough, madam. Do you wish the relics brought up from the crypt? I wish nothing that I owe to another's intervention. Put the image in place then, says the Duke furiously, and handed her Grace to a chair. She sat there, my grandmother said, straight as an arrow, her hands locked, her head high, her eyes on the Duke, while the statue was dragged to its place. Then she stood up and turned away. As she passed by Nencia, Call me Antonio, she whispered. But before the words were out of her mouth, the Duke stepped between them. Madam, says he, all smiles now, I have travelled straight from Rome to bring you the sooner this proof of my esteem. I lay last night at Montelice and have been on the road since daybreak. Will you not invite me to supper? Surely, my lord, said the Duchess. It shall be laid in the dining parlour within the hour. Why not in your chamber and at once, madam, since I believe it is your custom to sup here? In my chamber? Says the Duchess in disorder. Have you anything against it? He asked. Assuredly not, sir, if you will give me time to prepare myself. I will wait in your cabinet, said the Duke. At that, said my grandmother, the Duchess gave one look, as the souls in hell may have looked when the gates closed on our Lord. Then she called Nencia and passed to her chamber. What happened there my grandmother could never learn, but that the Duchess, in great haste, dressed herself with extraordinary splendor, powdering her hair with gold, painting her face and bosom, and covering herself with jewels till she shone like Our Lady of Loreto. And hardly were these preparations complete when the Duke entered from the cabinet, followed by the servants carrying supper. Thereupon the Duchess dismissed Nencia, and what follows my grandmother learned from a pantry lad who brought up the dishes and waited in the cabinet. For only the Duke's body servant entered the bedchamber. Well, according to this boy, sir, who was looking and listening with his whole body, as it were, because he had never before seen suffered so near the Duchess, it appears that the noble couple sat down in great good humor, the Duchess playfully reproving her husband for his long absence, while the Duke swore that to look so beautiful was the best way of punishing him. In this tone the talk continued, with such gay sallies on the part of the Duchess, such tender advances on the Duke's, that the lad declared they were for all the world like a pair of lovers courting on a summer's night in the vineyard. And so it went till the servant brought in the mulled wine. Ah, said the Duke. The Duke was saying at the moment, this agreeable evening repays me for the many dull ones I have spent away from you. Nor do I remember to have enjoyed such laughter since the afternoon last year when we drank chocolate in the gazebo with my cousin Ascanio. And that reminds me, he said, is my cousin in good health? So do you think it is a coincidence that the Duke brings up the cousin Ascanio to the conversation and asks if the Duchess has heard of him? She answers, I have no reports of it, says the Duchess. But your excellency should taste these figs, stewed in malmsey. Trying to change the subject, huh? I am in the mood to taste whatever you offer, said he. And as she helped him to the figs, he added, if my enjoyment were not complete as it is, I could almost wish my cousin Ascanio were here with us. The fellow is rare good company at supper. What do you say, madam? I hear he is still in the country. Shall we send for him to join us? Ah, said the Duchess with a sigh and a languishing look. I see your Excellency wearies of me already. I, madam? Ascanio is a capital good fellow, but to my mind his chief merit at this moment is his absence. It inclines me so tenderly to him that, by God, I could empty a glass to his good health. With that, the Duke caught up his goblet and signed to the servant to fill the Duchess's. Here's to the cousin, he cried, standing, who has the good taste to stay away when he's not wanted. I drink to his very long life. And you, madam? At this, the Duchess, who had sat staring at him with a changed face, rose also and lifted her glass to her lips. And I to his happy death, says she in a wild voice, and as she spoke, the empty goblet dropped from her hand, and she fell down on the floor. The hints are clear here, right? So apparently what was going on is that, so the cousin Ascanio was still in town, not in town, and it was in the middle of nowhere, but he was still around. So it's very likely that he and the Duchess were meeting secretly in the crypt, and that is why she continued to be in such a good humor and dressing herself so beautifully, using jewelry and ordering food more than enough for 2 people. And she did not miss the cousin because, in fact, she was seeing him all along. And that is probably what the chaplain saw when he peeped into the window and told the Duke. And that's why the Duke came unannounced to surprise the Duchess. And he does not leave her any moment alone, because otherwise she could contact the cousin and tell him to leave, right, to escape. So the Duke brings the wine and tells her to drink, and he makes all this very ironical or satirical toast to Ascanio, and she, the Duchess, toasts not to his life but to his death, because she knows what's going on inside the Duke's mind. Let's continue. The Duke shouted to her women that she had swooned, and they came and lifted her to the bed. She suffered horribly all night, Nencia said, twisting herself like a heretic at the stake, but without a word escaping her. The Duke watched by her and towards daylight sent for the chaplain, but by then she was unconscious, and her teeth being locked, our Lord's body could not be passed through them. The Duke announced to his relations that his lady had died after partaking too freely of spiced wine and an omelette of carp's roe, at a supper she had prepared in honor of his return, and the next year he brought home a new Duchess, who gave him a son and 5 daughters. Hello, Martina. Nice to have you here. So what do you think happened? So the Duchess drank the wine and died. Do you think the wine was poisoned by the Duke because he found out about the Duchess's adultery? We're almost at the end of the story, but what happened to the statue? That's what we have to know, because according to the legend, the face of the statue changed. The sky had turned to a steel grey, against which the villa stood out sallow and inscrutable. A wind strayed through the gardens, loosening here and there a yellow leaf from the sycamores, and the hills across the valley were purple as thunderclouds. "And the statue?" I asked. "Oh, the statue. Well, sir, this is what my grandmother told me. Here, on this very bench where we're sitting. The poor child who worshipped the Duchess as a girl of her years will worship a beautiful kind mistress, spent a night of horror, you may fancy, shut out from her lady's room, hearing the cries that came from it, and seeing, as she crouched in her corner, the women rush to and fro with wild looks, the Duke's lean face in the door, and the chaplain skulking in the antechamber with his eyes on his breviary. No one minded her that night or the next morning, and towards dusk, when it became known the Duchess was no more, the poor girl felt the pious wish to say a prayer for her dead mistress. She crept to the chapel and stole in unobserved. The place was empty and dim, but as she advanced, she heard a low moaning, and coming in front of the statue, she saw that its face, the day before so sweet and smiling, had the look on it that you know, and the moaning seemed to come from its lips. My grandmother turned cold, but something, she said afterward, kept her from calling or shrieking out, and she turned and ran from the place. In the passage, she fell in a swoon, and when she came to her senses in her own chamber, she heard that the Duke had locked the chapel door and forbidden anyone to set foot there. The place was never opened again until the Duke died, some 10 years later. And then it was that the other servants, going in with the new heir, saw for the first time the horror that my grandmother had kept in her bosom. "And the crypt?" I asked. "Has it never been opened?" "Heaven forbid, sir," cried the old man, crossing himself. "Was it not the Duchess's express wish that the relics should not be disturbed?" And that's how the story ends. Also an ambiguous end. Love ambiguous end. I think it enhances the spookiness of the piece. So what do you think happened to the statue? So the Duchess died very mysteriously, perhaps poisoned by the Duke himself because he found out about the adultery. And the little girl, she wanted to pay her last respects to her mistress. So no one knew that she crept in and looked at and heard a sound coming from this statue. And the face of the statue had changed. It was not the smiley, beautiful, calm face anymore, but that horror face. And there was a soft, low moaning coming out of it. So what do you think that is? Could it be that the statue was indeed the Duchess? That's why it was so lifelike. Or was it just in the little girl's imagination because she was so taken away by her mistress's death? What do you think happened to the Duchess? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this story by Edith Wharton, great American novelist from the late 19th and early 20th century. Martina says it was a great story. I like the way you read it. Thank you so much. I'm glad you liked it. This was a longer piece. That's why I decided to divide it into 2 parts, which means that we are 1 day behind schedule. So tomorrow we are going to read the story that was originally planned for today, which is The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois, also an American author, late 19th century, early 20th century author, and an early piece of science fiction. So tomorrow we're going to meet at a different time, but of course the video remains available to you at any time. So you can either follow it live or at the most convenient time for you. Tomorrow I'm going to be live at 5 o'clock Central European time to read to you The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois. I'll see you then. Have a great Sunday.